Welcome back, guys. This is episode 3 of my tips and tricks series, and in this video I'm going to be going over the basics of painting and weathering cockpits, and I'll do a little bit of some wheel wells as well, just the internal parts you need to do up before you assemble the aircraft. So yeah, we'll do some detail painting, some weathering, some black wash, some highlights, show you how to really make your internal components pop, and then yeah, that'll be that. So, as always, my name is Sean, and this is Sean's Aviation. So, for the basics of cockpit weathering and wheel well weathering, sort of the minor details, the interior details you'd see of an aircraft, I tend to get that stuff weathered before you assemble the aircraft. It's just easier to have all of that taken care of in advance. So for these few tutorials, I'm going to be using my Focke-Wulf 190 A8 that I'm currently building. So I have some of the parts out here laid to the side. I'll pull stuff in as I use it. So the first thing you need to do is go through and paint up a lot of the details. So for example, I've got my the cockpit tub here for the Focke-Wulf, the instrument panels. I've also got my wheel well. There's the cockpit seat, that kind of thing. So what you need to do, your best most instructions will have some examples of the details on what to paint. For example, with this Tamiya, they actually give you sort of the idea of the basics of what needs to be painted in the cockpit, the sidewalls, the black details over the gray cockpit. There's a decal for the instrument panel. Unfortunately, because of I got this kit secondhand, the decals were ruined, so I'm gonna have to paint a lot of the details on that. To me, instrument panels are really nice just because the decals only have the instrument faces, so they give the pop. As I said, I don't have it, so I'm going to have to kind of make up stuff as I go. So you've also got things like the control stick details, the side panel details, the rudder pedals need to be painted aluminum, the seat cushion we painted leather, the wheel wells have the back end of the cannons need to be painted gunmetal. So the first thing you want to do is get some of those details. Everybody has their own kind of feel for this stuff. As I've said in previous videos, I consider myself a 3-foot modeler. If models look good, sitting 3 feet away from your face or from your eyes, that's kind of what I'm going for. What you have to remember is in 1/48 scale, if your eye is 1 foot away from this tiny cockpit, in reality it'd be like standing 48 feet away from the real thing. So, at 48 feet away from a cockpit, think of standing on a 4th-story balcony looking down into a convertible, right? You get the idea of detail, but you can't really make out individual. You can't look in and see, the instrument panel and all the details on the cluster and then the gauges and the letters and everything else, and you just get the hint of detail. So that's kind of what I go for when I paint the cockpits. You'll paint some sections black, you might paint the odd little red or yellow kind of handle, make it look like it has some detail, but not really go crazy with it. So that's how I do it. When I get into the larger scales, obviously I'll paint things a lot more accurately, because you are seeing more of it. But for this 1/48 scale, even at 1/72 scale, I don't go too crazy with the details. So as I said, the first thing you want to do is you want to start getting some of these details painted. So I'm going to go ahead and get some of this stuff done. I've got my Model Master paints here. I use a lot of these for your detail colors. I just find the oil paints are a lot easier to brush. The Vallejo Model Air that you'll see in some of the airbrushing, I prefer these for the airbrushing paints. They're already pre-thinned. Like I said, when you watch the airbrushing video when it gets up, you'll see the use of this. But I find for brushing, the paint's a little on the thin side, so it doesn't quite, go on the way you'd like. So I've got some leather paint here, leather colored paint. And I'm going to go ahead and start painting the seat cushion. So there you go. You can see the, I'll zoom in a little bit so you get a better view here. There you go, you can see the seat cushion has been painted. Oh, it's out of focus. Why doesn't it want to focus on this? Come on. No, it doesn't want to focus. Let's zoom out a little bit again. There we go, that's a bit better. So you can see there's the seat cushion. It's painted in the leather color. It's not a perfect paint. You'll see, you can still see some of the underlying gray poking through. Perfectly fine. You'll notice leather has a very varied color to it. Some areas are very dark, some areas are very light. So having that little bit pop through is fine. Once I add some of the black wash to it, you'll see that the cracks and shadows really darken up, and it makes it look really realistic. So it's not you don't have to be 100% perfect. You want it to look a little dirty. So that's the beginning of that. I'm just going to continue on painting here. So I'm using a 10-0 brush, a 20-0 brush, sorry. So brushes are labeled sort of by number, which gives you a size of the brush itself. So there's like a 0, 00, 000, yada yada yada. So this is a 20-0. So the tip of the brush is a very fine tip, which allows you to get some really tiny details done when you need it. I've seen people take brushes and cut them down to like 1 or 2 actual bristles and just use that for doing some fine painting. Like I said, I don't do painting that fine, but I like this particular brush. It's an Atlas brush. It's got a triangular handle, so it's really easy to get a nice grip on it, and you can really get in really fine, into the details you need to do. It's got a nice big thick bulky handle. No chance of it kind of slipping and sliding in your hands. So I prefer the bigger handle for the smaller brush. So next I'm going to do the cannon barrels and breeches that you can see inside inside the wheel wells. I keep a pair of pliers, like plumber's adjustable pliers. Great for when you have a stuck cap on these. Open the plier till it's roughly the same size as the bottle, and a quick turn loosens it up. That way if there's any paint kind of dried in the threads, it comes off nice and easily. And the other trick is if it's really stubborn, you can run it under hot water and it'll just expand the cap just enough that it pops. So the paint was not quite mixed up as well as I would like. One of the easiest thing to do is just take you have old Q-tips laying around that I've been using for some old weathering jobs. I can just cut the tip off, use what's left of the plastic handle to give the paint a good stir. That way when you're done, you can just throw it in the garbage, and you're not wasting or using up anything. But the other thing you can always do, if you have any laying around, is just use old plastic trees, the sprue trees that the model pieces come on. Just get it in the garbage. Just cut the extra sprues off and use what's left of the trees as stir sticks. You can always do that as well. It's disposable. It doesn't cost you anything. It's already there. So, as I said, just we'll get these breeches painted, the barrels of the cannons. So this is the Model Master. It's actually the paint starting to to go funky on me here, so I don't know how well this is going to look, but as I said, with all the weathering, it's not really going to be that necessary or visible, really. So this is the Model Master gunmetal color. It's got a bit of a blue tint to it, similar to what you would see on gun barrels with the finish that they have. And again, you know, just the way I do it, I want to make it look close but not 100% perfect. So especially in this case where the barrels are molded onto a flat surface, that seam between the barrel where it meets the rest of the part, you know, you're never going to get a perfect line unless you're super careful in mask. But I don't really worry that much, because eventually when I black wash, you'll have a black line, like it'll settle into that corner, and it will hide kind of any minor inconsistencies you have. So I'm not terribly worried how close I get. I can always go back later on and touch up if I find that it doesn't look the way I like it. You know, like I said, to each their own. I'm more of a middle ground modeler. You know, I want them to look good, but I'm not striving for absolute perfection, and I don't plan to enter any of these into contests and try to win anything, so I'm not competing against anybody. I'm just doing them the way I like it to look and when I'm happy with it. So that is that. So there we go. We've got the seats painted. Those guns are painted. I took a quick look online for pictures of what the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190 looks like. They are very sort of dull. There isn't a lot sort of going on in the cockpit. A lot of the details are blended and bland, and it doesn't stand out very much. So I think just a basic weathering job will do the trick more than a lot of detail painting. So I got my flat black here. The one thing I am going to do, I'll pick out the odd piece. I'm not going to go super crazy and paint everything. But on the instrument panel, I'll pick out a few little areas that I want to touch up and make a little darker. So there's like the little square gauges up here. We'll paint black. What else? Maybe this little guy down here. And this little guy here in the middle with some switches on it. Give that guy black. Yeah, a little button over here. I'll probably paint red or yellow. So, you know, let's do these little guys right here in the middle too. I'm just, again, a bit of variation in color. You don't want everything to look exactly the same. You want just enough change to make it look interesting. So I'm going to paint the top of the control yoke flat black. As I said, I have also looked at pictures. I have a few pictures up on the computer screen behind me right now, so I have a bit of reference, kind of what I'm trying to do. Trying to make this look similar to what you see without being too crazy. I'll paint the section here around the throttle black. This little gauge over here will be painted black. What else can I paint black? Let's get this little handle guy here. And then this little doodad right here will paint black. So that'll be painted black, and I'll go through and I'll touch up some other little buttons with red and yellow a little later. Make everything kind of pop and stand out. So being that these are oil paints, you do have to clean up the paint thinner. I have an old jam jar here with paint thinner in it that I just use. And I have a lint-free rag, so you can just swish the brush around, pinch it between your fingers. I usually give the brush a little bit of a twist, you know, just spin around a little bit while you're pinching the bristles themselves. I used to soak brushes in paint thinner. Initially I just laid the brush, I just stuck the brush kind of in and just left it, you know, like that. I found over time your bristles eventually started to, not only is it sitting in all of the sediment that settles to the bottom, your bristles curl out. You get, if the brush sits at the bottom, the bristles curl out and it stays like that. so I find I was destroying the brushes. The other thing I started to notice was leaving them in the paint thinner for long periods of time started to destroy the glue that holds the metal end onto the actual brush. So the bristles were being bent, they were being stained from the sediment, the brushes themselves were actually falling apart. So I got in the habit of just cleaning them like that, swishing them around, giving them a wipe off, trying to keep everything as clean as possible. So for aluminum, I think eventually as I start moving to more and more of the water-based paints, when I buy paints to do these, because these bigger bottles tend to go bad long before I use it all, I'm probably going to start switching over to some of these smaller square bottles for the detail colors. Like I said, the red, the yellows, silver, black, leather. These colors that are generic colors that I use only once in a while, I'll start switching to the smaller jars. So this is my aluminium paint, which I will use. Aluminum, aluminium, depends on how you want to say it. I tend to watch a lot of British documentaries, so I've picked up the term aluminium. So I'm just going to paint the rudder pedals. Now in reality, as I have technically 3 of these Focke-Wulf 190s on the go at once, I should be, by all rights, painting all 3 sort of bits at the same time. All 3 cockpits, all 3 models. However, as I'm doing this as a sort of how-to video for you guys, I'm just going to focus on this one, and I'll go back and do the others at a later date. So normally when I do this, I pick one color, I'll go through, paint all of the one color across the board, let it sit for a little bit, come back, you know, pick the next color, go through, paint all of that, get it all done. But I'm just going to kind of get some of this stuff done quick, and then I'll come back and do the rest at a later date. So I'll get the leather paint back out again. So I'm also going to take the headrest, the armor-plated headrest that goes behind the pilot. I'm going to paint the, let's get you zoomed back in here. I'm going to paint the actual headrest itself, leather, as if it was a leather pad, but behind the pilot's head. And then in the in the cockpit tub itself, down at the bottom of the control stick where it goes into the floor, I'll paint it leather as if it had sort of a leather boot. It may not be 100% accurate, but I'm just trying to make some, as I've said, some detail and some contrast. Model building, in my opinion, the way I look at it, it's an art form more than anything. I'm not trying to make things 100% historically accurate. I'm trying to make things look good artistically, in a sense that contrast, weathering, you know. So there we go. That's sort of the basics. Just a little bit of red and yellow left to go. So I'll hold this up here. I'll zoom in for you guys to see. So there's the cockpit tub. Right, you can see the black on the instrument panel stand out a little bit. The leather boot. You've got your rudder pedals, painted aluminum. They'll stand out a bit more when you've got the weathering done. Your seat with your leather pad. I'll use tweezers here. Your headrest with the leather head bump behind the pilot. Your wheel wells with the gunmetal gun barrels kind of sticking out, which again will look like they're continuing straight out the nose, out of the front of the wing, and you'll see the gun barrels themselves out in front of the wing. So it's kind of the basic stuff. I'll grab my red and yellow. We'll get that stuff taken care of. One of the other tricks while I'm talking about painting and weathering that I'll show you. For these paints, I have a ton of these different colors. It's hard to keep track of. Every color, I just put a piece of masking tape on top. So you'll see that's 48, You know, that's number 3. So I actually throw numbers on them all, and then I made up a piece of like a little Excel sheet for myself. Keep this little folder here underneath, so you can go down alphabetically, find your paint number, come across. You've got the number that I have it on my top of my thing, the Model Master number, because some instructions do it by Model Master number. The FS number, so the Federal Standard number, which is the U.S. military's designation for numbers. So if I need to know, I need a specific, gray FS, for example, let's say I need gray 36314. Well, I can find it under the FS number and go back and find out what number I have, and also the name of the paint. And then over here in notes, I have some notes I've made for myself. For example, what color, if I've built a model in the past, like a Canadian naval aircraft, and I used a specific color gray for the top color gray, I'll make a note in that, so I know down the line, oh yeah, I used, extra dark sea gray, not ocean gray or whatever it might be. Just as a reference for myself to remember what color I used. So it's just a bit of a note for my own use. So I've gone through and done some of that. Makes finding colors a little bit easier. You're not scrambling to try to find stuff. So I've got my red paint out. Just going to paint a couple of little bits and bobs here. Red. Again, just kind of what else can I do here? You know what, I think I might, we'll do this guy down here. The edge of it red, so it kind of looks like the edge of the instrument panel. And I'll take the cockpit tub here. Just paint a few little, put that little handle there red, as if it's like an emergency release handle. Maybe something over here, oxygen system handle, who knows what that is. A couple of those little guys red, and there you go. So you can see it's just a little bit of red. I'll zoom in at the end here. I'll show you guys what it looks like. I'll get some yellow details painted. I find most cockpits, you're going to see a lot of red, a lot of yellow, warning zones, red, bad zones. You don't want to touch this button, don't do this, don't do that, emergencies, that kind of stuff. So red and yellow tend to be common detail colors. You'll also see greens and blues, but I find at this scale with the weathering that I do, the greens and the blues tend to disappear unless you go to a larger scale, so I don't tend to add them. So a little bit of yellow here, just to liven up a little bit. So we'll do that, and then I'll grab the instrument panel. And we'll do what? We'll paint these little guys here yellow. Paint one of these guys yellow. And I'll paint that guy there yellow. Okay. You'll also tend to learn eventually things like engine instruments tend to be red or yellow on them. Weapon systems tend to have red or yellow on them. Fire systems tend to have red or yellow on them. The basic flight instruments don't. So you'll see things on the instrument panel. The area kind of in the middle here, where your basic flight instruments are, they're going to not have the colors. You're going to have stuff at the top and along the bottom for like fire, like I said, engine instruments, armament instruments, fire instruments, emergency buttons. Same with this. When you're flying, pilots tend to have the right hand on the stick, the left hand on the throttle. So that means a lot of your switches will tend to be on the left hand side. Sorry, you guys can't even see what I'm looking at here. When you're flying, pilot will have his right hand on the stick, left hand on the throttle. So a lot of your extra buttons tend to be down the left side of the cockpit here, where it's available, right? If in an emergency you don't want to take your hand off your stick, you want to be able to just reach over with your left hand, push buttons, shut off the fuel flow, emergency jettison weapons, whatever you need to do in an emergency. So you tend to focus your colors on the left side of the cockpit and then across the bottom of your instrument panel. Up here is kind of like tape gauges for, I'm assuming, fuel systems or something, so I put one up there, just to make it stand out. So just a hint of detail, and then that is that. So that is sort of the basics of getting your painting done. As I said, you'll see it's a little bit easier in the cockpit, I assembled the control stick and the rudder pedals just for ease of painting. But for the ease of detail painting, you're better to leave off a lot of these smaller things and do them like this. So while that is drying, I will clean up my paint a little bit, and then we'll move on to the next step. The one thing you always want to be careful with your brushes, they come with these clear covers. Try not to lose them. That's what helps protect your bristles when you're not using your brush. So I'll clean up here for a minute and then we'll move on. So the next thing I'm going to do today, before we move on too far, and what I can get done now, is going to be a basic black wash. So you'll find on real airplanes, oh, I broke that again. Oh, you stupid landing gear. On most airplanes, you get grime and whatnot built up. Also, on a larger aircraft in real life, this is why you always keep a pair of pliers around. I'll zoom up just a little bit. There we go. When you're working on a smaller scale like this, the shadows don't tend to react the way they would on a normal airplane. So you use a little bit of this black wash just to imitate shadows that don't exist at this scale. So you want corners and indents to be darker, and you want bump outs to be highlighted, so that the shadows look darker and the up edges look lighter, and you're sort of forcing a fake perspective to happen. So for me, when I do the black wash, I have these little plastic shot glasses I got from the dollar store. It's like $2 for like 25 of them. So I use these. I had water and a little bit of soap in there. The soap just helps to break up the surface tension of the water so it doesn't ball up. It'll spread out over the model. I'm using just basic tempera paint. I think I got this stuff the local art store or Walmart. I can't remember now. I've gone through a few different containers of this stuff. But it's just basic water-based black tempera paint, the same thing that you let, Crayola makes for, toddlers to play with. So it's a basic black. So yeah, I mix it up here. I have an older brush that it's gotten ruined over the years. So I just give it a quick stir, make sure the black gets all mixed up nice with the water. The nice thing with this is if you mix it, you get a nice consistency all the way through with the black pigment. If you let it sit for a day or two, the black pigment will settle out and you have a less black water at the top if you want to do a little bit less of a shadow, and at the bottom a nice thick sludge so you can get a really dark corner if you really want to do a dark corner. So if you let it sit for a day or two and it separates out, it gives you a little bit more ability to vary the colors that you do. I also have white and brown for the different models I've done. When I do night fighters, I'll tend to use white to highlight the panels. Being a black aircraft, the black panel wash will disappear, so I'll use white to pop it out. And then in some cases you can mix up brown and do a bit of brown in some areas to look like, staining and whatnot. So I usually take a piece. I'll get you zoomed in a little so you can see what I'm doing here. Pick a piece. If I can use a pair of tweezers, I will. And then all you want to do is just use your brush and just cake it on. With the soap mixed in, when it breaks the surface tension, it'll flow nicely down into your corners. And you want as much of that black paint to build up in the little indents and shallows and edges as you can. And the nice thing is you can use your brush. You can grab, I have more of this lint-free pads around. You can clean your brush off, and you can use your brush to go back, and your brush will actually suck up excess liquid. So if there's some areas that have a little bit too much, you can use your dry brush to suck the liquid back off of the item. So I'm just going to zoom in here quickly, and you'll be able to see the difference. So there, that is an unpainted, painted unweathered one. With the black wash, you end up with that. So you can easily see how, it's still wet, it'll dry up, and it won't look as dark. It will darken a little bit, but it'll look less shiny and less dark when the water evaporates and all you have left is the black pigment. But you can see how just already this one looks, you know, quite a bit more used, for example, than this. This looks like a toy. This starts to look more like a real piece in service. So that's kind of what you want to do with the black wash. So I just go through all my pieces, just gentle. You don't need to do lots. I don't brush it on. I tend to dab it on. Dab it where you want it to flow. And it kind of does the work for you. You never really want to leave a space that doesn't have any of the water. It will, when it dries, you will clearly see the spots that have had it and don't. So you kind of want to make sure that the entire part gets covered with at least a thin layer. But this is where you can go by with back with a dry brush and clean up the areas where you don't want a lot of pigment. So same with the main wheel well. This is nice. It's got all these little perforations in the floor and lots of little corners and edges. And right now you guys can barely see any detail on that. It just kind of looks flat. As soon as I start adding this black wash into the corners, you'll see almost immediately how much the detail just pops. So just that, you can start to see. And you get little bubbles. So you can go back, as I said, with a dry brush, clean up the little bubbles. But already you can see how one side tends to look, you know, a little bit better than the other. You can see a lot more detail on one side. Now once I go through and dry brush that and pick out the highlights, it will be amazing. So, and the other, I guess, good reason of doing this one aircraft on its own, not only does it help me focus on the steps for this video, but at the end I will have another version of this, the Focke-Wulf 190 Dora 9, that I haven't weathered, and you guys will clearly be able to see the difference between a weathered piece and an unweathered piece, just to really see the benefits of doing this. So I'm starting to get these little bubbles that form in these holes, so I'm just going through and popping some of them. I have another product I will use a little later on. It's a Tamiya Weathering product, so it's a panel line accent color. I've tried this out a little bit. I'm not a big fan of it. I find it stains. It doesn't quite do what I like it to do, and it's hard to clean off. But I'll probably use that in some of these little holes to ensure that it really does what I want it to do. So now we'll take the landing gear, the wheels. Again, just jam it all into all the edges like that. You could always have a bit more pigment. You're not going to notice it on the black tire. So if you have a little bit of over brushing, it doesn't matter. But just dab it in there. Get as much pigment as you can in there. Let the water dry. So again, you can start to see the difference between a weathered wheel and an unweathered wheel. Just gives it a little bit more of a pop. Once I get these done, like I said, with the highlights, the lowlights, the shadows, everything's completed, I'll compare them with what the unweathered ones look like from the Dora 9 kit, and you'll definitely see a change. Now with the cockpit being such a dark color, this shadow material, this black wash, isn't going to make that much of a difference. However, it will make some difference. So you're better off to apply it and have it do nothing than not apply it and wish you had. Especially when it comes to the seat, for example. I want to weather the seat so that you can see the detail with the leather. So you've got your seat with the leather cushion. As soon as I add the black wash to that, it's just going to make all of those little shadows and edges just kind of pop. So, don't know how much of that you can see. And then when you weather that, you don't want to highlight the leather. The leather doesn't tend to have like white highlighted edges. So you want to make sure that you shy away from that. I'm not going to, again, focus too much on the cockpit, just because you're not going to see much of the shadows. I'm just adding it so that it's consistent across all the parts. As much as you do get a difference between like highlights and lowlights and different colors and that I can't think of the word right now. The difference in colors and everything, it also tends to get an overall sameness. You don't want one part of the cockpit to be lighter than the other, or one section to have weathering and one others. It just kind of looks weird, unless you're specifically going for like a replacement look. That contrast, you know, as much as you want to have contrast, you also want everything to look similar. You want it to look like it's one plane and not a bunch of different parts all kind of put together. So there we go. Oh, I got the landing gear still to do. So I managed to break a piece off the landing gear. If you watch any of the other videos of me building this kit, you'll know that these landing gears tend to have a very finicky, very loose connection system. So I've already managed to knock the piece off, but I'll just do it separately. But yeah, so you just go along, same thing. You want to use, especially on the landing gear, try to get as much black into all the little nooks and crannies as you can. Landing gears tended to take a beating. A lot of dirt and grime and whatnot built up on landing gears, so give it a good solid coating. Make sure all your little nooks and crannies, especially something like this, you know, it's kind of hard to see the little details. There is a lot of detail in the kit, in the molding, about sort of the structural frames that are included. So when you actually weather it down, you start to see, you know, you see the fact that it does have a lot of little bits and bobs on it. And the other thing with these landing gears is they will get a good, like I said, dry brush, pop out the highlights, as well as the the strut itself here at the bottom. Let's get this guy to spin around. The shock strut at the bottom of the actual part of the strut that goes in and out, the shock absorber, it will be painted a bright chrome silver near the end. So it'll really make, after it's all flat coated and done, you paint that, it really makes it pop. So again, you've got your sides of the fuselages. You're not going to see much in here, but between the regular paint color and the shadows and the highlights, it doesn't hurt to just give it a good quick coat, especially, you know, areas where, you know, you will possibly see some of the details. You do want it to have a little bit of a shadow. And then the wheel wells inside the wings, again, you'll see, you know, a basic gray color. It looks flat, monotonous, almost toy-like. You start to throw in a little bit of this black wash, and all of those little wires and all the little nooks and crannies, everything starts to pop, and it gives it depth. It gives it realism that you don't normally see. And you can always go out and past, cover the entire area bigger than what you're going to see. Same as painting. You don't want to find out afterwards that one little corner is still showing. So again, you can really see the weathered wheel well versus an unweathered wheel well. And finally, the main set of wings, again, because you're going to see sort of the forward edge of these landing gear bays, just give it that coat just to make sure that that color stays consistent. You don't want lots on it, you just want enough to shift the color gray to match everything else that you've already painted. Adding the black wash, as I said, you get a thin layer over everything. It slightly darkens all the colors, and you just want to keep that consistency going. You'll also start to see, what I talk about bubbles, because I've added the soap. You get a bunch of these little bubbles forming across the back. Dry your brush off and just come back and start popping, smoothing those out. If you leave the bubbles there when they do dry and pop, it leaves a little spot of darker pigment, which kind of can sometimes ruin the look you're going for. So it's nice to just kind of go through and ensure that everything's just a nice, smooth, even look. So there we go. So that is the basics. Actually, you know what? While I got it, just to be safe, I'm going to get the inside of the cowling, just so that it, again, looks the same. There's a little lip in there, a little seam where the two pieces of plastic meet. So I'm just going to use a bit of this black wash just to highlight that, and then just kind of get in all around the edges. Make sure that it all gets coated. And there you go. Inside the cowling, and then just inside that lip where there's a seam inside the two pieces of cowling that meet together. So that is the black wash. So now you've seen the detail painting, the black wash. I'm going to let it sit for a little bit. It's probably a solid 24 hours. Come back at this tomorrow morning. Let all of that black wash dry. Let the water dry out of it. You want to ensure that there's no water. When you're going to come back with the dry brushing, being that it's an oil-based paint, you don't want to be painting over the water. So give it lots of time to dry, lots of time to ensure that when you come back, you're going to be getting a good solid coverage and not mixing up the water with the oil. So we're going to leave it at this, and we will get back to this in a little bit with some more weathering, so stay tuned. Okay, so here we are, about 24 hours or so since I did the first black wash, and as you can see, it has dried up quite nicely. The one thing I always find is that the pigment always comes out lighter when it dries than when you apply it. I'm sure that's just a property of it being, you know, liquid and whatnot. And the other thing I've mentioned earlier is you'll see how they tend to not settle in those little dimples. So in that case, if you look, for example, on the wheel wells, everything has settled in nicely. It's got some good shadow, some of the landing gear, right? It pops the detail quite a bit better than it did before. It's just things like, or even the wheel, the doors. You can see how the doors themselves have a nice coat of black wash. All the little panel highlights, kind of the shadows, I should say, stick out. The only real issue is things like that, where you want these little dimples to be obvious. So what I would do in this case is use the Tamiya panel line accenter that I showed you guys earlier. So it's this. This comes in multiple different colors: black, brown, gray. Give you the different abilities for the different shades that you're doing. I'm just going to use it to pick out some of these little details. So it comes with, just like the glue, a fine brush, sort of attached to the handle, really fine point. I'm just going to load up a little bit of the black wash and just start picking out . The one thing you have to be careful with this is it is an oil-based wash. So if the base paint you have used, which in this case I have, is an oil-based paint, then you will end up with the ability that if you're not careful, it'll soften the paint underneath. And if you try to wipe it, you will smear the underlying color. So what you can always do is ensure that the layer underneath is a different base. So if it's an oil-based paint and you have an oil-based panel wash, then ensure that you put a layer of Future or a water-based clear, something in between that so that the oil won't affect it, if you need to do any type of wiping. But as you can see, that just kind of makes those little dimples pop a little bit better, and as that dries off, as just like with the other stuff, the pigment will lighten up as it dries up, but at least that makes it a little more poppy with the little dimples. But while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and do a highlight accent to all of these other pieces. Now, the color you use for your accent is going to depend on what your application is for. If you're doing, for example, tanks, armor, and you just want to do highlights, you're going to want to use a lighter shade of the same color. If your tank, for example, is a dark green, you either want to find just a slightly lighter shade of green, or take the base color green, actually physically lighten it with some white paint, and then use that for your highlights. You don't necessarily want to use a gray or anything else. I'm using a very light gray, FS36492 Model Master. It's called light gray. I use the lighter gray. I find in a lot of cases when you're doing things, you're going to have, usually cockpits are a green or a lighter gray, and so this color gray isn't too much of a contrast. In the case of this cockpit, for example, where it's a really dark gray, almost a black, the contrast is going to be really high, but I don't mind it so much simply because of the fact that it is such a small cockpit and it is going to be harder to see the details anyways. I want to almost over exaggerate that highlight just to make sure that you can see the details. Plus, I'm not going to be caking it on. As you're going to be able to see, it's going to be a very thin layer. So I have my lint-free rag that I use for my brushes. I just try to find a spot that's a little cleaner. I have an older brush here that's been it's kind of been flattened out and destroyed, so it's really no good for any type of real painting, so that I use it for this. So you just kind of load up just a little bit of paint. You don't want a lot of paint on that brush, and then what you're going to do is you're going to take it onto your paper towel or whatever you use, and you're going to try to get almost as much out of it as possible, so that the brush is almost dry. And that's where the term dry brushing comes from. If you've ever heard the term dry brushing, this is what it is. There's just a hint of pigment on the brush. I'll start with the instrument panel, just because the detail is going to pop a lot more. So you can see it's a little hard to make out the details, and all you do is take your brush and just lightly brush it over the surface, and just a little bit of that pigment is going to kind of stick to the highlights of the detail. It's going to pop the highlights. It also tends to make it look a little bit like a chipped paint look. As things get used, you get little bits of paint chips and wear happening. So this will kind of imitate that look as well. So I always go around and get all the edges, all the highlights, just make it pop. And just like that, you suddenly have an instrument panel with detail on it. So it makes everything just look amazing. So that's what you're going to do. You're going to go across, just for example here, the rear deck behind the cockpit. Again, it's kind of flat looking. So you just, I'll actually hold it here. I'll do it so you guys can watch. You just quickly dry brush. For this example, this one, because it's the airflow goes from front to back, I'm going to brush front to back. That way any streaks look like it's going sort of in the direction of flight. If anything, for example, had been flown back or whatever, a piece of equipment or dirt or whatnot, it kind of goes in the direction of airflow. So just like that, suddenly it has a little bit of depth and color to it, and you can easily pick out all of those molded in details. The seat, as I mentioned before, you want to be careful because you don't want to necessarily dry brush on the leather pad. You just want to get the edges around it where you would have wear and tear. You can kind of dab it to make it look like there's some scratches and paint wear along the back, where boots and buckles and stuff would hit. Same along the front edge, where all of your, again, boots, buckles, pants, bits and bobs will chip and knock over time. So it's not much, it's just a subtle look, but the seat starts to look, as if it was in use. So the cockpit tub will really kind of show off how the change. So as you just go along, pick out the highlights. You'll be amazed how long you can go with just that little bit of pigment you put on the brush. Because it's just picking out highlights, it's not taking a lot of pigment. It will last quite a while of you going around and going. And in some cases, the less pigment that's on the brush, the better. For example, in this case, I can sort of get the brush jammed down inside, and it doesn't lose a lot of pigment. So it tends to get the look that I want. But don't worry if there's too much over top. I mean, it's you're not really going to notice, but you know, it just gives that a bit of a pop and a kick to that look, and you can see all the little details, and it looks like it's been used. I don't really dry brush the exterior of my aircraft. I use more of a paint technique to make the weathered look on the outside. As I said, a lot of armor builders will do this. Figure builders will do a lot of dry brushing on the exterior. But just for an example, you can see here's just a black washed door, and then with the highlighted door. You know, just again, just a little bit of a pop. And I'll show you here in a second kind of an unweathered door. I'll grab one of the doors from the Dora 9 at the very end of this. I'll go through and compare some of the parts from the Dora 9 that have zero weathering to these parts here that have quite a bit of the shadows and the highlights done, just to give you an example of kind of what the look that you're going for. I'm not going to do the wheels, but the armor plate, again, you don't want to hit the leather. You just want to kind of get around the edges, the places where you would see paint chipping and wear and tear. Just a little bit more, so you can kind of start to see when your brush loses enough pigment that you're not really getting much out of it, and that's, you want to load up and again try to clean up, get as much of the liquid out of the brush as possible, so it's just a little bit of pigment that's in there. So the landing gear, same thing, just give it a quick, the landing gear I don't go too much, I just do enough to make the highlights pop. I'm not really too careful with it. I don't want to do too much. You can very quickly sort of ruin the look of a landing gear or some of the exterior parts for this. It's just the hint of shadow. So you kind of have the highlights are painted a light gray, the base is painted a medium gray or whatever color you've used, and then the shadows have picked up the black, darker black wash that makes it look, you know, some depth included to it. So again, around the cockpit, I try to beat it up a little bit more. Cockpits always get tons of wear and tear, people climbing in and out in the rush, combat, you know, like I said, who knows whether, you know, as the pilot's been flying, some buckle or, you know, something in the cockpits come loose and moved around and chipped and knocked and whatnot. So I always beat the cockpits up quite a bit. Even real aircraft, you can get inside, you know, some of the warbirds that are flying around or whatnot, and you'll see that they're just, some of them, depending on who the operator is and what their focus are, some of them are just beat up. The wheel well, kind of get in there and just highlight all those little details, all little wires, edges of all of the little ribs, everything. Just again, you want the corners to be light, and the outer corners light, inner corners dark. So just a quick brush over. The good news is if you ever really overdo this, it's a simple process of just kind of repainting. Now that I say that, I'm probably just going to do a little bit on the wheel hubs on the outside just to make things pop, but try not to get the tire itself because you wouldn't have had that on the tire. So there we go. That is pretty much all of the bits and pieces for the Focke-Wulf 190A8 having the highlights. Actually, now that I say that, one piece that I still need to do, the wheel well still needs to be done, and this little guy here, the Canopy Rail. He was didn't get the black wash, but I'll do some of the highlighting, the dry brushing on him just to make it. I'm not even sure whether you can see this when it's done, but just in case, I want to weather it again, make it look like it's been part of the plane. Like I said, you want to kind of try to make all the parts roughly the same tone, whether it be the black wash or the paint or the weathering. You don't want one part that just looks completely different from the others. You want everything to look like it belongs and has all been through the same sort of, you know, ringer, so to speak. So the last bit here, you'll see how that black oil has dried up a little bit. It's a little less dark than it was, a little lighter. But I'm just going to go through here, dry brush through the highlights. There's a lot of little bits sticking up in here, so it's nice to kind of get in there and make sure everything pops. Because the base color gray and the dry brushing gray is a very similar color, you can kind of really go to town with this. You're not going to overdo it as much when the colors are similar. And that's why I was saying it's good to try to pick a color that's close, just slightly lighter than the base color, because you can just give her like this, and they will be, you won't notice it as much if you go on a lighter color than with a darker color. So there's the wheel well, a bit of weathering, a bit of highlights. Yeah, just looks like it's you know, been flying around for a few hours, gone through some combat, gone through some dirt and grime. So I want to call it there. Later on, you know, when the model is kind of a little bit more built, you can always go through and pinpoint some other stuff if you want to do some more, make some more stuff stand out. The one thing I haven't done yet, I haven't painted the engine for the Focke-Wulf 190 yet. I forgot about that while I was doing the other color, so I'll have to go back at some point and do that. It's going to need to be weathered, so I'll probably end up weathering it on its own a little later on. Luckily, it's not hard. As you guys saw yesterday, I did all of the detail painting and all of the black wash. You know, in maybe took me a 2-hour window to go through and do everything. Today, it's been a couple of minutes sitting here doing the highlights, so it really doesn't take long. So you have that ability to go back and do stuff a little later as you feel fit. So at this point, I am going to, actually, I'm going to zoom back in. I'm going to go through and I'm going to compare the Focke-Wulf 190D with the Focke-Wulf 190A8. And the thing is, you don't notice it as you're doing it. You know, you see a little bit of a change here, a little bit of a change there, but you don't notice it really until you compare to the old parts. So that is the A8 part that I have done all the weathering on, and this is a standard painted wheel well from the Dora 9. So you can just see again how it's just a subtle change, but it's just enough change that this guy here looks like it's been through life, and this guy looks like it's fresh off the production line. And even then, this doesn't look like it's fresh off the production line. This looks like a toy. It doesn't have depth, it doesn't have color, it doesn't have work done to it. So, you know, it's just minor changes, but those minor changes make a huge difference. So things like the gear doors, it's kind of hard to hold these in the way it shows you. So, you know, the gear doors, again, you know, it's not a massive change, but it's just enough to make it look real. The instrument panel, I always love the change in the instrument panels. So there's an unpainted panel, and then there's the painted panel. So it's just, you know, it looks so much more realistic when you do the weathering and the highlighting and everything else. And then you've got your standard Dora 9 cockpit tub, and then your fully detailed and weathered A8 tub. So you can easily see how you can see much more detail in this over this, and it didn't take long to do. It didn't take a lot of expensive equipment or crazy techniques. It's just simple simple techniques that pretty much anyone can do. It doesn't take long to learn. A bit of practicing, you know, that's all it takes. The wheel wells, you know, an unpainted base, unweathered base painted Dora 9 wheel well, and then the same part for the A8 that's had all the weathering done. And I think the final one I'll use is just going to be the inside of the cockpit. Again, sort of a base Dora 9, and then I'll cleaned up and weathered and detailed. This one isn't as obvious. There isn't much going on inside the cockpit. Some of the aircraft that have more detailed sidewalls will definitely make a difference, but you can still see how like the little, wheel and some of the highlights pop on this one and not so much on this one. So it's just minor details that make it look so much better for a finished product. So that is the basics of cockpit and wheel well detailing and weathering. I'll have another video a little later on for the detail work for the the exterior weathering of an airframe, using the black wash and using like exhaust staining and gun staining and all that kind of stuff. I'll do another video a little later that includes some of that stuff. But yeah, so that is that. If you guys have any questions, comments, any techniques that you have used that I do not, that you think is worth it, throw it in the comments. I may always, if I see a technique in there that I think is a good idea or that I've never thought of, maybe I'll make a follow-up video of me testing out that technique and trying it for the first time. So by all means, leave the comments, leave the questions, leave the tips and tricks that you guys have, and we can make this make these things look a lot better. So that is that. Thank you for sticking around and watching this, and I will see you on the next one.
Thank you for watching, guys, and as always, if you are interested in any of the content you see, you can access my website at www.seans-aviation.com. You can see all the latest pictures of aircraft and museums and the build logs of all of my current models and past models on that site. And if you're interested in any of this content, please click the subscribe button here on YouTube to follow more. Thank you very much, and see you guys next time.